Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Path 11 podcast. My guest today is Fred Matser. He is the founder and chairman of the Fred Foundation and a leading Dutch humanitarian. He's been active in social and ecological transformation and is the founder or co-founder of a wide range of charitable foundations that span the fields of health, environment, nature conservation, peace, and global transformation. The principles underlying these foundations are based on inspiring co-creativity, self-sufficiency, empowerment, inspiration, and harmony. He is also the author of the book Beyond Us, and I had the opportunity to watch his lovely documentary called Beyond Me. So, Fred, welcome to the Path 11 podcast today.
Thank you, dear April, for having me.
Yes.
Wonderful. 9 o'clock with you in the morning?
Yes, it is. And what time is it there for you?
3 in the afternoon.
All right. So I'm just waking up and you're ready to go. Wonderful. Well, I really loved your story. It's really interesting how, when I was watching your documentary Beyond Me, kind of talked a little bit where I'd like you to start to let my listeners know a little bit about the relationship with your father, who your father was and how you kind of came into more of a businessman role. But then you had a really life-changing event that you were feeling a call to become a humanitarian. And then there's this really interesting story about this healer that you had gone to and had what I would say sounds familiar to almost like a near-death experience without dying. Like I've spoken to a lot of people who have had a near-death experience and they enter into this oneness. They enter into this space where all is one and they can understand this concept where the veil is lifted and that they merge with this greater consciousness. And that happened during a healing session that you had. And then we'll kind of launch into a bunch of questions. But I'd love for you to give our listeners just a little bit of an overview of how this journey happened for you.
Yeah, thank you, April, for asking the question. We go back to 1985. I had stepped back from a business career that I was more or less forced to go into because my father suffered from Parkinson's disease and had diabetes. He died in 1977, and I already had started to work for humanity to lead a worldwide program at Red Crescent in Geneva to help and reduce child mortality and morbidity related to the dehydration that goes with diarrhea. And we can talk about that perhaps later because that's also an amazing story. But anyway, so it was that in Verbier in the mountains, a friend of mine had an apartment and he has had a healing from an American man coming from New York. And he wanted me, knowing that I had latent diabetes, to undergo the same treatment. So what happened is that I found myself in the apartment. The man, with a friend of his, gave me an enormous portion of vegetables that he cooked half and asked me to drink 2 liters of water. And in the meantime, he said, I'm going to give you a minusculous portion of condensed nutmeg. And this is an invention of Dr. John Salk. I remembered the name at the time. That was the father of the polio vaccine that he invented in the early 50s. And he said, this man, Elliot Postal, I treat Mr. Salk himself with this stuff. And so after having had the food and drunk a lot of water, he put me in a hot bath. And then I underwent a very powerful massage on the floor. In the meantime, the song We Are the World was playing. And I don't remember ever experiencing sound, and what I later learned to express more like the intensity of vibrations resonate through my body, of which I became kind of super aware. And I felt extremely good. I be beyond good feeling. And at a certain moment, I had a flash that said, a friend of mine, Sally, she is breaking her collarbone on the slopes. And she will be here. This was Verbier, was a ski resort. She will be here in 15 or 20 minutes, and then she will say that she needs an ambulance to be brought to the hospital. And exactly as I saw it, she was there at the given time, and indeed she had broken her right collarbone. And from that moment on, I started to be extremely interested how I, with my consciousness, relate to a field of consciousness in which apparently information, that what expresses itself in form I call information, that happened at another time and at the same time but at another spot, how I could be linked to that. Anyway, more to say, but that was the first experience that I would describe later as superbly blissful. But during the last, 35, 40 years, I've had more experiences like this, and the essence of it I would describe as and I described it in the documentary, you go through a veil, say it's a curtain in a kitchen or in a living room, and you go to the other side, which is still an action in time and space. And then you find yourself on the other side of the veil, and you look around, and there is no veil. There's nothing. And there's not even me. There's just sheer feeling, sheer experience. There's, on that side, no beginning nor an end. And I would describe it as an ongoing orgasm, but then not in a sexual way, but like a feeling that's not within the skin, but beyond the skin. And it is experienced in itself. It doesn't have beginning, nor does it have an end. And if you would look up the watch, which I did once when it happened, it was in a kitchen or at a home where we lived in Geneva, it was something like 12 seconds. So that later on I came to understand we all live a sequential life that goes by the clock. And the experience I had was not sequential. It was a transcendental experience.
Yeah, and I know too that one of the challenging things when I talk to people that have this type of experience, they say there really aren't words for it. And there's a great section in your documentary where you go into language and how there's so many other ways that we can communicate as human beings, but our primary focus is on the words and on the language. And you go to explain, that kind of like leads into this other space of the unknown or something that we can't really see, but we can perceive. Talk a lot about spending, time there and to access that through meditation. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about just the way that we communicate and the language, because there was a great example that you gave when you were a little child observing, I believe it was a lily, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, indeed, I describe it often in such a way. We all were born, and we were born without words.
Right.
But slowly our eyes opened, and we could see the eyes of our mom, of our dad, brother, sister, grandpa, whatever. And at that stage, because I still remember doing it also with my grandchildren at the time, they're no older, but that you connect with the energy in the eyes and you allow the connection to be made through your eyes as well. And then there is wordless communication between the baby and you. And I remember as a young boy, because you refer to that, indeed, that I walked around this period of time in the winter, and how do you call these snow bells? Yeah, and I saw snow bells, and the snow bells generated enormous, profound feeling of happiness in me. And I had no idea of the word snowflake, I was just not burdened with a word. Like when you smell an apple, you smell the apple and you see the skin of the apple, you feel the taste, but you're not burdened with apple. It's not a concept, it's the experience. And then slowly we invite that child in the world of words, the world of words. And yes, we think we help the child, so the child learns concept. And through the learning in concept, through the learning to express ourselves in words and numbers, we can make comparisons, we can order information, and based on that, we can communicate with others, not with dogs, not with trees, not with whatever, but with people that speak the same language. In the meantime, what we hardly are aware of is that we are exporting our experience, our direct information that goes through our feeling into the words, that because of the use of the words, always are expressing that what has happened. It's not happening, but it has happened. So that what we call consciousness, within consciousness, we have the mental faculty that uses words, that uses numbers, words and numbers. And the whole communication between people goes through that mental faculty, through the ratio. So we have applauded our capacity to think in our mental capacity. And what we have forgotten as a little child in the corner, the orphan, often they say, that is our feeling capacity. We're not trained. We're trained to think. We're educated to think, and trust our thoughts, but we're not trained and not confirmed in that feeling gives us equally, if not more important information, and learn to trust that.
Yeah, and you gave a great example. And, we've talked about this before on the podcast before about meditation and how, so again, so many people that I've spoken to, when you sit in stillness, that is when you have more access to that divine, to that other divine intelligence. And you talked about that as well, but I had a question because I was a little confused. You had mentioned that when you're meditating, your vibration lowers. And I wasn't sure, because I've always heard that like the vibration when we're accessing meditation goes higher, but I wasn't sure if you were you talking about like the brain waves going into
Yes.
more of a, okay.
So that is a wave, is an expression of a vibration.
Okay.
And remember, in the most subtle fields is the lowest vibration. The intensity of vibration augments when you go to the higher densities. And it's indeed in the spiritual world, they say you go on a higher frequency, but they never explain what it really means. It's an expression. But if you go to physics and you go to measure, then you will find lower vibrations. If you make an electroencephalogram, you see that when you meditate, your frequency goes down, your heartbeat goes down, your breathing goes down, everything goes down. Near death is the lowest level of frequency with the highest access to divine information.
Mm-hmm. And I loved, you kind of made me laugh a little bit in your documentary where you were like, Something to the effect of, how could you expect to hear God when all you're doing is thinking, 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 thinking? It's like you
Yeah.
have to slow the thoughts down, like stop having the thoughts. And, you really emphasize that about finding stillness and to
Yeah.
finding that quiet. So that's, you said, and I've experienced this personally, that is when that information comes in. That it can be confusing because it's like, well, that doesn't even feel like my thought. Where did that thought come from? But it's in that stillness. And when we quiet our mind, and as you say, come to that lower vibration, that we're able to access a bit of what you've experienced.
Right. Well, we are sharing it. We're in the same field.
Yep.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
With many of the listeners, I assume.
Yeah. So the other thing that I thought maybe we could also talk about is, it was pretty prominent too in the documentary that here it was, you were this successful businessman, probably had a ton of money, but you weren't feeling fulfilled. And I wanted you to move into talking about just that materialistic worldview and how there is so much scarcity and fear. And I'm working actually with this whole concept with a woman's group right now about trying to come into a better relationship with abundance and looking at how the energy of the world really is so abundant, yet the material world and kind of like our Western culture is all about things and money. And like you said, scarcity, with the pandemic now, how many people are in fear because they're either out of work, they're not making money, they can't pay their rent, right? There's a lot of energy and focus around money and what that can bring. And also on the other side of that, the scarcity of us not having enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking, April, this question. Let me first try to step into the explanation from the physical side, from the materialistic side. What I understand when you would define the finite by time and space, that when we look at the totality of space, if you express it with an atom, with a molecule, or with an eon, or whatever, it are expressions from high densities deep in the earth to the most subtle fields at the edges of our universe. The quality of whatever you describe is that it coexists with all the other elements. There is no element that you describe that can be at the exact the same spot as another. It's a very important insight because that means that the whole of space is an all-inclusive, ever-changing, dynamic system that runs by the phenomena of resistance, which exists by the phenomena of polarity. By the polarities plus and minus creates resistance, and that's the phenomena by the grace of which the whole phenomena of space exists. So that's one quality of space. Time, if time was, you live in a different time than me, and there's a time difference between my nostrils even. Why? Because if time would be defined, this is Einstein, by the speed of light, and a light photon would travel from, say, the sun to the earth, to me, it would travel with a speed of velocity of 300,000 kilometers per second. And you would stand in between somewhere, between the sun and me, then that light photon is first with you and then with me. So whatever element you take in space and give a description of has also a different time coefficient. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's coexisting. So if we all understand that it is an all-inclusive system, and funnily enough, the planet is round, and we can see that we are all taking part in the game of gravity. I always say with a little joke, everything on Earth and wherever coexist. We live together. Don't live against you. I cannot compete with you. I cannot compare with you because you're different. I can only compare with myself if I feel better than yesterday or not. So the first observation is that it is an all-inclusive system. We, the humans, have one of the billions of expressions of life. We have an idea put in our mass mind, which is there is scarcity. So, and when there's scarcity, you have to fight, you have to compete, you have to take care that you, number one, that you get the stuff. So you, in an all-inclusive system, you start to exclude. And I would say in the school of philosophy that we live, the humans live dominated by this philosophy of materialism. We buy that. So instead of coming from love, we come from fear. So by exclusion. And that's a consequence of the materialistic worldview. What we are aiming at with our newest foundation, Essentia, is to introduce in another worldview. And that worldview is the worldview of the non-dualism or the idealism, that school of philosophy, which basically says, and this is perhaps a leap too far, the school of idealism says that consciousness, we have not yet really addressed consciousness, but consciousness is a timeless and a spaceless phenomena. You cannot find consciousness. So the idealists say consciousness creates the universe, creates the brains, creates the trees, creates the bodies, creates everything. So you cannot find a spot where consciousness is. And the materialist says our brains, human brains, they create consciousness, so they give it a spot. But if you go and look in the brain, you can never find the spot where consciousness is. So it is our belief, I mean, the people from Essentia is led by Dr. or double Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, is that if we in the next 30, 40 years help the most prominent scientists to offer them the right scientific information, that they from their self will be convinced and will shift their worldview. And from this inclusive way of thinking and feeling, we are not trying to convince others, because we know also that it is not nice if somebody tries to convince you. It's nice to be provided with information that you share with somebody else, so that that person has the time and space to absorb the information and may change his position or her position.
Yeah, and wouldn't you say too that part of that in sharing that type of view and hoping that that changes is that it also has to come from the being level. Like, you know, it's not like you're trying to convince somebody about this consciousness. It's like they also need to experience what you're talking about in order for it to be their reality and real.
That, because indeed thank you very much, April, to bring that to my attention, because I often say we are human beings, and the human is the material, is the finite expression of the being, and being means essence, which means the infinity. So we can decide to live in a body, and then one day we will die and everything is over. If we have repeated over and over again that is it, that indeed it is it, and there may be a lot of fear around that idea that you die one day. But if you are able during your lifetime to move your consciousness from your human to your being, then the only thing that can happen is that the human will end one day, but the being in itself infinite, will always exist.
I
Or
love that.
exist because it is it is timeless and spotless.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I've never heard anybody just actually break down the word human being before. I've heard the saying, we're human beings, not human doings or doers. And, people trying to remind people to come at that being level. But I really like how you described the human and the being. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And I wanted to express because it's not me. Way back, people knew already. That's the point of reference. The very, very early colleagues
Right.
that lived, they knew it already.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, would you also like to talk about your book, Beyond Us?
Yeah, well, yes, you can ask many questions. I have broken it up in chapters and with different subjects. Indeed, we already covered words. We have competition, goals, path, knowledge. Well, you can ask anything.
Yeah. Well, what about the one on the self expression? You tell a story about Mary, and you feel like that's kind of
Oh
relevant to
yeah,
the
yeah.
situation in our families
Oh
now.
yeah. That's not my story, but wow, that's a wonderful story. Who mentioned that to me? An American. I may remember the name, and then I'll tell you, and I'll share it with the listeners. And this is the story. There is a mother in the United States. It's summer, and it's early in the morning, and it's a beautiful day. So 4 or 5 o'clock or so, the sun is up, and Mary, being 4 years old or so, is fully awake, and she steps out of her bed. And what she finds on the floor is a lot of crayons. And she was lucky enough to find her room to be done with fresh, light wallpaper. And she thought, wow, that's an ideal spot to create, to start make drawings on that wall. So she picks up all colors and starts to make all kinds of sketches expressing what she feels, and she has lots of fun. And after a certain time, she hears footsteps on the hallway, and then she hears the flush of the toilet. And again, she hears footsteps, and the door goes open. And little Mary, 1/3 of the size of her mom, looks up and sees her mom at the safety of being breastfed by her mom. And mom starts to shout at her and says, "What are you doing here? You are just destroying the wall that we kindly, or we prepared it for you to have a fresh look, and you cannot do, you never, never, never go and do this anymore." So mom closes the door or slams the door. Mary sits there. And what happened to Mary in the future is that Mary closed down her feeling capacity, her creative expression. She listened to her mom. She listens to the teacher in school. She listens to the professor. And Mary became an eloquent academic. And in a way, what she has done, she has exported her own inner trust to the outside world. And when I read this story or heard this story way back 35 years ago, I thought that happened to me too. I was listening to others. I'm listening to others. I was not really supported on being myself. You were good when you could copy somebody else. Then you were awarded and recognized and whatever if you do what others people want you to do. Then you're a good boy. So that's perhaps a drama of millions of people.
Yes. And I think so many people are on that journey and that quest to quote unquote find themselves,
Yeah.
those words are used so often with people that I work with. I feel like I've lost myself. I don't know who I am. I'm trying to find my way back, to who I am. And you're right, kind of sifting through all of these different impressions and listening to what people have said about us or the opinions that they have about us, we tend to take those and create this other personality in a sense. And then that usually feels uncomfortable. And then people can't stay in that personality of what was created by others. And we tend to go on to this self journey and self exploration. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, Fred, thank you so much. I think we actually covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. I'd love for you to let our listeners know where they can find your documentary, purchase your books, and any other information that you would like to share with our audience. Please do so.
The documentary you can find on beyondusdocumentary.org. And for info and if you go on our website, fredfoundation.com, .com, I think .com, or essentiafoundation.com, then you have much more information about what we do. And by the way, perhaps also, we have not talked about it, but we also started the foundation 2 years ago. Forest Peace, we call that foundation, to buy nature and agricultural land and transform agricultural land back into nature, to take the poison out and to do that forever. And so we, in our situation, we do not really want people in nature anymore because we want nature to be itself and allow itself to grow and communicate the way it is done in nature. And hopefully to inspire people to rediscover their own inner nature and push out all those dysfunctional cultural elements in their being, which I'm doing every day still, work in progress.
Yes. Well, I think our world is very lucky to have you here in it with all of the beautiful work that you're doing. So thank you so much. It was an honor to speak with you today. And we'll be sure to put all those links in the show notes for our listeners to be able to access you more easily. So thank you so much, Fred. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very, very much, April. And to everybody, miles of smiles, sprinkles of twinkles, and lots of love.
Thank you. Bye. Take care, everyone.